We really are very privileged to have our next speaker with us, our technical keynote, Joe FitzPatrick, who's come all the way from the US to give this presentation. Joe FitzPatrick is an instructor and researcher at securinghardware.com and really is one of the best hardware people in the world today. He spent over a decade working on low-level silicon debug, security validation, and penetration testing of CPU, SOCs, and microcontrollers. So let's welcome Joe to the stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for coming right after lunch. I always find right after lunch to be one of the most interesting times to present. All I have to do is make sure everybody stays awake, and I have succeeded. I know this because I am a chronic faller asleeper when sitting down. I think it's because I'm always underslept, but so it goes. So today I'm going to talk to you about making the most of your hardware work, making the most of your hard work when it comes to hardware. A little bit about me. I'm Joe FitzPatrick. You can find me on Twitter as SecurilyFitz. I've spent 15 years doing lots of fun things with hardware, and I would say I'm working on hardware for 15 years, but I can't really claim that all of it has been actual work. I did silicon debug on desktop and server CPUs, followed by some pen testing of desktop and server CPUs, which led me into training. I was training people who do hardware validation to make sure your chips function properly, to help them find security vulnerabilities in silicon, right? So this is the people who maybe would have found the cool stuff like these side channel architectural bugs we've been finding lately, but perhaps they missed them. Past 5 years I've been doing securinghardware.com. I do physical attacks training. Basically, let's get physical access, let's take apart some hardware, and let's learn what we can do. And I also have been doing a couple events called hardwaresecurity.training, along with other people who do hardware security training. Aptly titled. Hard what? So a lot of people dismiss hardware. Hardware attacks are too difficult. There's a lot of work. You have to get like wires, and you have to have solder, and you have to have physical access to things. There's also physical access. It's too high a barrier for attackers, right? In order to attack with hardware, you actually have to have some hardware knowledge. You have to actually have physical hardware. You have to have physical access to a system, right? There are all these factors that make it such that hardware is a little bit harder than software. So maybe it is named appropriately. One that I hear a lot is that only nation states and their victims need to worry about malicious hardware, okay? So for a long time, people said, this evil maid attack, these implants, all this stuff that you talk about, this is all fantasy. And then about 6 years ago now, there was this leaked ant catalog from the NSA of all these cool toys that the intelligence community had to go and exploit systems, little pieces of hardware. And this actually showed that there are people doing this kind of work. There are actual real hardware implants that are malicious. And what's interesting to me is the fact that what was $50,000 in 2008 was reproducible for $100 in 2014, and you can buy on Amazon for $10 in 2018. If you'd like to, I don't have a picture of it in the slides, come find me the rest of the day, today or tomorrow, and ask to see the USB cable I have. So let's kind of go with a little story. Anybody familiar with Jemima Puddle Duck? Right? This is a Beatrix Potter story. Jemima Puddle Duck is a goose, a duck, an upright duck, and all her eggs get taken away from her because that's what gooses are for, or sorry, ducks are for. You harvest their eggs. So she decides to leave the farm and go looking around. So she's kind of like a software person looking for a hardware platform to work with, right? So she doesn't really know what she's looking for. She goes down the street. She finds, I forget the fox's name, but she finds a fox. And the fox says, oh, you need a place to lay your eggs. I have the perfect spot for you. Come down to my shack. I'll give you a nice warm bed of hay. You can lay your eggs there. I'll even help you keep them warm. And this is, this is the unknowing software person going into the world of hardware and having someone say, oh, yeah, we have secure boot. Yeah, we have hardware crypto. Yeah, come on. So she sits on her eggs. They're getting close to being hatched. And the fox says, oh, next time you're into the farm, would you just grab an onion and some celery? And she's like, okay. So she goes into the farm. She's talking to the dog and says, yeah, I'm staying with the fox. He's great. He gave me a place to keep my eggs. But I just need to get him an onion and celery. I'm not sure what for. The dog kind of has a clue that she's being played. So the dog calls his puppies, and they follow her back. And when the fox tries to trap the goose in the duck, sorry, in the barn, you know, and sorry, the dogs come and save her. Okay. The point being, you have yet another hardware security vendor showing up to save the day. The thing is, when the dog shows up with the puppies go and eat all the eggs. So, like, this is supposed to be a kid's story. I'm not sure where they, what kids were like 100 years ago, but I think it's pretty interesting. So let's take this into consideration. So all this stuff about hardware being difficult is true, right? It's harder than software. It has a lot longer development cycles, right? With software, you make a change in code, you compile, you're done, right? When it comes to hardware, when we're talking about simply like an embedded device, we can make a change to code, we have to compile it, but then we have to get that code onto the piece of hardware, right? We've got some nice microcontrollers that make it a lot easier now. We can do it wirelessly, we can do it over the air. But even when you get down to the lower levels, when you have to rebuild hardware, actually respin boards, you're talking it, instead of taking moments to rebuild or make a change, you're talking about weeks or months even. Because of this, you get fewer development iterations, right? The moral of the story is when we have hardware that is developed like this, hardware gets pushed out a lot quicker and a lot more unreliable than the software that we expect to use on top of it. And lastly, it has real tangible costs, right? It's pretty easy to install a development environment on your laptop that you already have and start coding away. When you want to actually dive into the hardware, you have to go to a conference and get a cool badge that comes with a microcontroller to get you started. So when it comes to attacking with this hardware, right, hardware attacks are riskier to deploy. You actually have to physically be somewhere. You might actually get caught, right? When you do it over the internet, you could be that 400-pound hacker in your basement or a troll farm in Russia or anywhere else in the world. Who knows, right? There's a non-zero risk of you bricking the equipment you're dealing with, right? If you have a hardware attack that involves opening up someone else's computer and soldering to it, you better be very confident in your soldering skills. And lastly, they just don't scale. Because of this, because you need this physical access, because you have to have devices that cost money, right, you can't scale this like you could a software attack. It's easy to go and fire off, you know, a Mirai-type attack on a bunch of IoT devices because you can just do it with a loop, right? We don't have the ability to, like, for I equals 0 to 1 million with hardware. Because of this, though, hardware goes a long way, right? There's a lot of people who are ignorant to hardware vulnerabilities. We heard earlier today about the whole Spectre meltdown realm of issues. And what's interesting to me is it's been over a decade that we've known that there are timing side channels in CPUs. But it was only in the past few months that people started realizing, like, we can actually exploit these. And it's only in the past, you know, couple months we've actually seen a response where we actually fixed some of these things. There's also general laziness, aka efficiency, right? When a hardware attack is not realistic, why would you bother putting all your effort into protecting against it? And again, there's this perceived barrier to entry. You can't get into hardware without some hardware to get started, right? Whether that means you have to go to a conference and get your badge, or whether you have to go and order parts, whether those parts cost $5 or $50 or $50,000, that's something that just doesn't exist without a hardware situation. So another story, we've got the ugly duckling. I think you've all heard of this one, right? So the ugly duckling is actually a swan that is born into a family of ducks and just doesn't fit in, right? No matter where the ducks go, the ugly duckling is like, yeah, you don't belong here. You're not welcome. They didn't go so far as, well, yeah, actually, depends on the version of the story, depending how kid-friendly the version of the story is or PCI's the story is. This ugly duckling is outcast. And I kind of see hardware as the ugly duckling for a long time. But now that we start to see a lot of these issues, the ugly duckling is kind of, you know, growing its feathers and showing up to be quite a potent actor and, you know, a beautiful swan, perhaps. So what can we do with physical access, right? So let's go through a couple scenarios of how we might attack with hardware. If we decide that, you know, we're doing a pen test or red team engagement against someone, something, an office that has a certain model of router. So how can we get our hands on the same model of equipment that they have? eBay, right? Or just actual retail channels. And then can we learn anything just by looking at it? So when you get a piece of hardware, when I get a piece of hardware, the first thing I do is open it up and see what I can find. And usually the most valuable thing to grab off of this hardware is the firmware, right? So we've gotten here a picture of a SPI flash chip. This little chip costs maybe $1. This is the chip that holds your BIOS. When you boot your PC, this is the first code that's run. This is the chip that holds the firmware for your Wi-Fi router. When it powers on, it loads an entire Linux kernel right off of that. So this tiny little chip is quite potent in what it can do and how it can give you control. So if you, sorry, let me take a step back. Also, it runs very standard protocols. When we're building hardware, right, hardware is kind of the bottom of the barrel now. Everyone wants to make it as cheap as possible. So this chip is made by Winbond. I can tell that because of the label on it. But there's 15 other manufacturers that'll make an identical chip that fits in the same spot. In order for this to work and make hardware reliable and affordable, we need to go and have standard protocols. So it's totally trivial for me to hook up a logic analyzer and listen to this protocol and know that it's going to be the exact same protocol that I see on any other SPI flash chip. But here's this thing. Do we even need to go to that level of detail? Do we need to go and put the effort into hooking up wires to the system? Or can we get the firmware another way, right? So what happens if we just go to Netgear's website? Welcome to the Netgear Download Center. To find documentation, firmware, software, or other files, enter a model number. So you type in the model number of the device someone else has, and there you go. You've got your firmware image. You don't always get a full firmware image, so that can be a dilemma. You might actually want to go and get an actual system to dump it. You may not get all the revisions of the firmware, so you may actually have to find a piece of hardware to dump it, get the exact same revision of the firmware on your actual target. But it's a great place to start. So we've got this firmware image. What do we do with it? Well, slice and dice it. There's a tool called binwalk. It's pretty straightforward. You run binwalk and the file name, and it goes through and it looks for all the files, all the file systems, everything in this piece of hardware. And so we see here we have a Linux kernel, we have some compressed data, and we have a file system. Okay? That's all pretty cool. When we extract that file system, we have a whole bunch of files, and we just look for the right file. So there we go. We've got our shadow file. We've got a bunch of hashes, and if you're a bottom-of-the-barrel, cheap hardware manufacturer, you're not going to put a lot of effort into having good root passwords, I bet. So a few minutes of cracking those hashes, you'll find that one of them is A and the other one is admin or something silly like that. The point being, we're done with the hardware at this point, right? We have, instead of spending all our time taking hardware apart, disassembling hardware, desoldering anything, we've taken what we know about hardware, we've extracted the firmware, we've turned it into a software problem, and we've got credentials, right? So making the most of hardware is making the most of all the information you have to immediately turn around, spin it, and turn it into a software approach. We win. So if you want to learn more about this whole process of reading firmware, there was a recent presentation that I thought was really great by the Cyber Gibbons. You can go check it out. And he gave different ways of bypassing code readout protection. So it's not always as easy as having a chip that's a standard chip that has a known way of dumping stuff out. It could be that the microcontroller has a fuse blown, a manufacturing bit set that says, oh, no, you're not allowed to read the firmware. So you have to use some more advanced hardware techniques. But we won't worry about those now. So we've got another little Aesop's fable, the duck and the golden eggs, right? So a farmer had a duck, and every day the duck would go and lay a golden egg. And the farmer's pretty happy about this because, golden eggs are made of gold, and gold's valuable. So he, got a golden egg every day for the next couple of days. Like, oh, wow, I want all the golden eggs now, right? I want all the firmware. I want all the secrets this hardware can give me. So let me go get that duck and slice it open and find all the eggs. Of course, he slices the duck open and only finds one egg. I guess the moral of the story and how it applies to hardware is get what you need off of a system. Dump the firmware you want. Get as far as you need to without destroying your hardware, because once you've destroyed your hardware, it's a lot more difficult to repair it and get it back. That might be a stretch. But again, if you're hooking up to hardware, you're reading stuff off of there, loose clips can fry chips. So be careful when you hook your wires on there. You might destroy things. And it really stinks when you only have one piece of hardware and you're trying to get firmware off of it and you fry it, and you then realize immediately exactly what you did, and then you go and buy another piece of hardware for another $300, and then you hook it all up and do the exact same thing again. And I wish I had only done that once, as in the whole scene, destroying two pieces in a row. It happens. So what else can we do with physical access? Let's say we can't get firmware for some reason. We have a chip that has code readout protection or something enabled. Well, let's look at other things that we can observe. Okay, what can we observe? Does the system have flashy lights, right? Flashy lights are kind of great because everybody loves flashy lights. So if we look at those lights, you might have hardware at home that has flashy lights, and all you know is it flashes. That's not true. It doesn't just flash. It flashes for a reason, right? Whether it's telling you CPU usage, whether it's telling you disk access, network activity, those lights are actually useful information. And if you can observe your system long enough and understand what it's doing, you can literally characterize a system just by watching flashing lights. These are actually special flashing lights. You'll notice I have clips attached to them. On this actual system, the flashy lights also serve as JTAG pins. So I have a debugger hooked up to those flashy lights. But that's another story. What about power consumption, right? Every single system that you have consumes power. Now, you can do this at a coarse level. You can look at the power at an AC wall jack and see how many watts of power system's consuming, and it'll give you coarse information. Am I doing a lot of computation? Am I processing video or crypto stuff? Or am I sitting there idle? Just that much information is useful. Or you could get a lot more fine-tuned, use an oscilloscope, and look at the voltage over a small resistor in the system. And you can see very carefully what we're looking at in this image. On the left side, we have a blue line, which is a normal operation mode. And then this chip, it goes to sleep for 15 microseconds. And then it wakes up and it spikes. Well, the reason this chip goes to sleep for 15 microseconds is because they don't want you to know how long it took to match your password, right? So what happens is we compare passwords. Let me give it a step back so I can explain what this is doing. This is a pin matching system. So you type in a 4-digit pin, it checks your pin, and it unlocks the safe when it matches. So what it's doing is it's going to go and calculate those 4 digits and say, OK, your 4 digits match, or your 4 digits don't match. But I don't want you to know that I figured that out yet. Let me wait a few more seconds and time it. But by looking at the power consumption, we can see, oh, it actually took, let's say, 3 microseconds to calculate, and then it spent the rest of the time idle, right? We can tell what the system is doing by looking at fine-tuned power consumption. I even tried at one point in time to reverse engineer a cookie recipe by looking at the power consumption of a stand mixer. And while I was able to identify whether I was adding eggs or flour or butter, I never actually got the quantities accurate. So I did a lot of testing, and lots of things were really good, but not many of them looked like cookies. A system is going to access data. Whether that data is stored on flash or firmware, or it's stored over a network interface, it doesn't matter. Every time data is accessed, something's happening to the system. So if we take the time to observe, whether it's flashing lights, whether it's power consumptions, whether it's data, and we can get a steady state image of what the system is when it's doing nothing, then we start poking it. Then we start making it do things, and we can actually learn more about what it's doing. One of the greatest things we can get off the system is debug output, right? It'd be really cool if we could just hook up a wire and log in and get a root shell, but it doesn't always work that way, right? Sometimes we'll look at a board and we'll find just a serial port. This PCB is the same as the PCB that's inside a monitor that I used to have. And it's not a smart TV, it's nothing fancy, it's literally just a monitor, but it is running Linux on a MIPS CPU, and it does have debug ports, and it does have firmware, all to run the on-screen display. So we go and we look, we find the serial port circled in red at the bottom, and we hook some wires up to that, and we can decipher it with a logic analyzer, right? So logic analyzer is a tool that 10 years ago cost $10,000. Maybe 15 years ago cost $10,000, but now you can have one, I have one somewhere, like $10 for a cheap knockoff logic analyzer, $50 to $100 for a decent, low-spec, simple logic analyzer. And we can sit there and we can observe these signals and know exactly what the system is saying. Once we have characterized exactly what we're looking for, we can use a purpose-built tool, a serial cable. I carried a half a dozen of these with me at any point in time because once you figure out how to hook them up, you just want to leave them hooked up. They're so cheap. You hook it up, and you get a serial console. And you may not get an interactive console. You might just get debug output. And what's that useful for? Let's say you have an IoT device, right? And you're a software, you're a web app person. You go and you hook it up to the network, and you start doing your web appy stuff and using those software tools that web app people use. I don't know much about it, so I think that's obvious from the way I'm talking about it. But you go to get into a login screen. You're like, oh, I want to log into this system, so I'm going to log in as user AAAAAAA, right? And you hit enter, and then the system doesn't respond for like 2 minutes. What's it doing? It's rebooting. That doesn't really help you. So you know it reboots when you hit AAAAA. But if you have a debug output and you get the crash dump every time it crashes, what do you get? You get registers, you get instruction pointer, you get code, you get stuff out of memory. So you get all the information that you need to go and turn what is a physical access attack, use the physical access you have to enable your software attack. And you win. So maybe you're a little bit paranoid. Who here has soldered before? Who here has burnt themselves soldering before? Who here has destroyed hardware soldering before? Keep doing it. You'll eventually stop doing it, and you'll still do it just less often. So if you're really paranoid and solder and wires and stuff, there's USB. USB is great because it's like hardware attacks with the safety gloves on, right? There was this report done by a group in Israel where they said there are 29 flavors of USB attacks, and they grouped them into 4 different categories. And I think that there were a couple of redundancies in there, but it was a really nice index. So we have a malicious hardware device. This is a piece of hardware that's designed specifically to be a bad USB device, right? It's a development board or a chip or a circuit board designed to be malicious. Then we have malicious firmware on an existing device, right? And I like this better because as much as I'm a hardware person, hardware is a lot of work. Why would I build a hardware device when I can just take someone else's existing hardware device and reprogram it? It's a whole lot easier. Or you even have a normal device that behaves properly, right? And you put a malicious payload onto that device. So you might take a USB drive and put some bad files on it. You might take a network adapter and modify how it routes things. And lastly, there's malicious electrical attacks, the USB killer scenario where you have a device that you plug in and electrocutes your computer with lots of volts and makes smoke come out. A less elegant attack, but depending on the scenario, it might be really effective. Make backups. What's cool to me is there are commercial tools to do most of these. So if you want to dabble with hardware attacks, even if you have no hardware skills and you don't even want to look at a circuit board, you can go to Hack5 and you can buy the Bash Bunny or the USB rubber ducky and implement a lot of these different categories of attacks, right? At the same time, you can homebrew almost all of them and not need to solder. This is a teensy microcontroller. I really like these because they have a really robust USB stack, and they also are Arduino compatible. Who really loves Arduino? Who really hates Arduino? The reason why I like Arduino is because it's a single-click installer, and if there's something I dislike more than software, it's tool chains. So I like Arduino because you could just get a tool chain, you just single-click, install the stuff, you have everything you need to program and write code for a device. So this is the Teensy. It does a lot of USB stuff. I've used them for scripting, keyboard attacks. I've used them for more bespoke USB maliciousness. They're quite powerful, and they're like $10 US. And here's a little bit about another factor in this. Like, it makes sense, even though you can go and you can buy a USB rubber ducky, it makes sense to go and grab a microcontroller and program your own USB hit attack, your USB keyboard attack. Because if you're familiar with POC or GTF Code, the International Journal of Proof of Concept, or Get the F Out, it's a periodically published journal, in quotes, with lots of neat hacks and tricks and other things. And Travis Goodspeed, in one of the very early issues of it, mentioned a parable about building your own bird feeder. And the moral of the story is basically, just because you can go and buy a bird feeder ready-made, or just because there's someone else who's a professional bird feeder assembler, doesn't mean that you shouldn't avoid the process of going through all those steps to build it. What's great about this is you learn more than you'll expect, right? You'll learn all about the process of building a bird feeder. You'll learn all about the process of finding wood and selecting wood and using the tools. So it's really an education to go through this process and do it yourself, instead of just going off the shelf and getting tools to do it for you. And then you win, because you learned something. So there's another story, the story of the mallard and the woodcock. And the mallard is giving the woodcock a hard time because the woodcock is a very picky eater. It only eats very certain types of food. And the woodcock is giving the mallard a hard time because the mallard eats everything. Like anything that is floating around in the water, the mallard will gulp up. And the way the fable goes is the mallard is swimming around and swallows a fish hook and chokes on it and dies. And the woodcock is looking for food, so it flies away to another pond and gets caught in a net and dies. And again, I'm not really sure about all these fables and the messages we're trying to send kids, but the moral here is criticizing others' faults, right? I've encountered people who are like, oh, no, USB hit attacks, that doesn't count. That's old news. Well, why would you criticize an attack that works reliably so often, right? How many of you have plugged in a USB device that you didn't fully trust? How many of you know you're not supposed to do that? How many of you did it anyway, right? Sometimes you got to get work done. So, you can't fault the user for plugging in a USB drive. You can't fault the user for opening someone else. So don't fault anyone for their quirks or idiosyncrasies or their strange eating habits. That one's a little bit of a stretch. So let's talk a little bit deeper. What about fancy interfaces, right? We went from all the wires and looking at circuit boards and soldering things on to USB, where we didn't have to go and do anything. We just had to plug in a little socket that has four pins already in the right spot for us. What about fancy interfaces? PCI Express is hard, right? I've been playing with PCI Express for a long time. It's running at 2.5 to 8 gigahertz, right? That's slightly faster than a serial port running at 57 kilobits per second. It's locked up inside your PC. You're not supposed to touch it. You're supposed to turn off the computer. You're supposed to ground yourself. You're supposed to plug the card in the slot, screw it in, close the case, and say your prayers before you go and power the system on, right? It's not like if you want to go and tinker with it, you can't do like the olden days where you just get a parallel port and you hook up wires and you can send bytes and bits to it. It's not that easy. So, and here's just a photograph of a handful of the PCI Express hardware that I've tinkered with. We've got an FPGA board. We've got some cables and adapters to plug PCI Express into different form factors and cards that I can sit into. We've got some tiny FPGA boards, as well as some ASICs that are programmable and let you do interesting stuff with PCI Express. So there's a lot to it. PCI Express is hard. It's also expensive, sort of. But here's the thing. If it were too hard, no one would use it, right? We have little microcontrollers that have PCI Express. So you can go and you can buy embedded devices using PCI Express that cost anywhere from $10 to $100, right? If PCI Express were truly hard, there'd be no way to develop, never mind test or sell a product that used it. So it automatically connects and negotiates. Cool. I don't have to worry about any of that stuff. It has lots of layers of error checking and correction built into it, right? Basically, PCI Express was designed so that if a really bad designer built a board, it might actually still work. And it wouldn't be it would be the designer's fault that it was low quality, but there's high likelihood of success. FPGAs can do PCI Express out of the box. One of those devices I showed before, two of those devices, the large one on the upper left and the very tiny one on the upper right, those are both FPGA-based boards. And you can see there's a huge scale difference. But both of them are able to do PCI Express out of the box. You do have to download 20 gigabytes or so of vendor tools and install them. But the vendor supplies you with demos that let you do memory attacks. Memory tests. Attacks, tests, whatever, same thing. Thunderbolt is great. Thunderbolt can do it too. So consider the security implications here, right? Let's make a way of connecting everything inside of our PC. And we want to connect our memory, we want to connect our graphics cards, we want to connect our network adapters, we want to connect our CPU. We want to connect multiple CPUs even. Now, we'll put it all on a single circuit board, we'll put it inside a box, we'll close up the box, and we'll say that's our security boundary, right? And we have this security boundary, and that's it, we're done. We're complete. This is great, awesome, except for step 4. Any ideas what step 4 is? A decade later, make it externally accessible, right? So we build an interface, and even if we do think about security, we think about from the perspective of saying, oh, this is an interface. This is a valuable interface, but it's OK because it's constrained. It has a barrier to access. And then you say, oh, let's make it into Thunderbolt. So this hemisphere has a great history of DMA attacks and other stuff, going back to some awesome FireWire attacks 10, 15 years ago, a long time ago, 30 years ago. And also some PCI Express attacks over Thunderbolt only 6 years ago or 8 years ago. But what's really interesting to me and what I like to point out is the pattern and the trend, right? Who here is familiar with 386 page mode memory access, right? This is the great new thing, 32-bit memory, flat memory addressing. Every process has its own memory space. This is great. Why? Because if we have a process that's doing bad things or making mistakes or error-ridden, it's not going to take down your whole operating system, right? 3 to 6 page memory was intended as a reliability feature to make your operating system more reliable. At the time, it was not intended as a security feature to protect your process from other processes, right? It's not designed from the beginning to be a protection against malicious processes. So, am I online? Am I getting text messages from someone? Let me get offline. Sorry. Disconnect. Back to the topic at hand. So 3 to 6 page mode memory. How about embedded graphics, right? Have graphics always been embedded? No. We used to always need to have a discrete graphics card, right? And then we started having embedded graphics, but these embedded graphics were actually just chips on the motherboard that were graphics cards. And then they were chips in the chipset. So we'd have a CPU and a North Bridge with graphics inside of it. Now we're at the point where our CPUs have graphics embedded right inside the core and the interconnect between the various cores in the processor. So we take something that was outside of our security boundary and we move it inside our security boundary. This is where things get sticky because you're not going to build graphics from scratch when you move the location of it. How about IP blocks on an SoC? And it's funny because this is the second time this week someone said SOC and not SoC. And it's funny because when people say SOC, I think SoC. And when I say SoC, people think SOC. Not a systems operations center, but a system on chip. So when you build a system on chip these days, you don't build it all from scratch. You don't build it all yourself. You go and get third-party IP blocks that do the jobs you want them to do, and you glue them together, and you send this off to a third-party manufacturer that ships you back a bunch of chips that may or may not work, right? Well, how do these things communicate with each other? There's an interconnect, right? This interconnect is designed for all your valuable I/O. But when you have a situation where your third-party audio driver, audio controller, is sitting on the same bus as your security engine, is sitting on the same bus as your hardware crypto accelerator, you might encounter some very interesting kinks in your hardware, in your security model, in your security boundary that you're dealing with. And of course, people say, like, oh, this Thunderbolt stuff is fixed, right? And for the most part, well, no, for lots of parts it is, right? On various certain models of Macs, they've actually done a really good job of protecting against all of the great Thunderbolt attacks and PCI Express attacks and DMA attacks that people have thought of. But here's the cool thing. Hot swap predates Thunderbolt. Cool thing. Here's the sad thing, bad thing, whatever. It's all perspective, right? Hot swap predates Thunderbolt. You used to have hot swap on servers where you could like push a button, turn a key, remove a card, put a new card in. It's made for servers, but even systems that don't support hot swap fundamentally support the protocol and state machine that enables hot swap. You're not going to go and make a separate PCI Express controller for your hot swap systems. You're going to cut and paste a PCI Express controller in all of your systems. So if your system doesn't support hot swap, what can we do? This is the M.2 AE keyed Wi-Fi adapter in a slot inside of a Chromebook, right? And so this is a little card. It's in essentially a PCI Express slot. But when I put the system to sleep, so does the network card go to sleep, right? And when the network card goes to sleep, it stops communicating to the host system. And when it's asleep, I can pull that card out, I can put my malicious card back in and turn the system back on, and it retrains this device. And as long as we don't have too much traffic going to that device, the operating system assumes that that's still the network card at the other end, which is great if you want to do your own stuff and you want to start doing DMA attacks against the system. Oops. I was looking at another system where we were trying to get some memory acquisition going. And we pull out these big, U4 servers. And they've got a whole bunch of processors and lots of memory and all this stuff. And they have a whole bunch of PCI Express slots. And we were trying to figure out which one to do, or whether we can actually reliably put the server to sleep and wake it up. Usually you can't. I was looking through, and I saw this chip. This is a PLX Technologies PEX8624. And I'm actually familiar with this chip. This is a PCI Express switch. So if you have a system that only has one PCI Express port, but you want to put 5 cards in it, you use a switch. And it's like a USB hub. What's really cool about this switch, though, is this switch has, it's configurable, right? It's got some firmware that it uses, and it's got a debug header. And the debug header is only 3 pins. What's also really cool is this chip is designed for people who are building devices, and so they have to give you the ability and the support to make your system work. So instead of opening up this server and trying to find a PCI Express slot to stick my card in and coax the system into believing it should be allowed to talk, all I have to do is hook up to the 3-pin debug header, and I can inject transparent packets into all the PCI Express buses on the system. So, sometimes you need the hardware, sometimes you don't actually need the hardware. And we got a little story. It's the fable of the ducks and the fox. So these ducks are going to the pond. They're going from home to the pond. I don't know why they just live next to the pond, but they go to the pond to go swimming around, and they see a fox. I'm like, oh, the fox, let's just walk by him. And the next day, they're about to go to the pond, and someone says, oh, remember the fox was there? You shouldn't go the same way. I'm like, oh, don't worry. And they walk again, and sure enough, the fox is still there, just watching them. And see, nothing happened. The following day, they're like, oh, yeah, see, the fox was there, nothing happened. We'll just go the same way again. Of course, that time the fox is sitting there waiting with a bag to capture them, and unlike other fables, they didn't get captured and killed. They ran around and turned around and ran back home. So what's the moral of the story, right? If you encounter a path that isn't working for you, if you encounter some difficulties, right? If you have trouble dealing with the fact that you can't find the right slot to plug your card into, take a step back, look for an alternate route, right? There's almost always an alternate route that's going to take you to the same endpoint that you want. Especially if you're new to hardware, this is going to be really difficult because you're trying to reproduce one thing you know how, and you're not taking the time, you don't have the knowledge or background experience to see all the other opportunities that are there. So it's difficult, but it's something to always keep in mind, right? When an issue gets fixed, is it actually fixed? Or is it just remediated? Is it just patched over? Or is just one way of accessing this issue or exploiting this issue fixed? If something, again, if something appears too hard, try a different approach, right? Your time is valuable, and there's no sense spending all your time banging your head against the wall on the hard things when there's all the easy ways in just around the corner. I'm really good at doing that, banging my head on the wall. So we got through 4 scenarios. Different ways that we can go and tinker with hardware and maybe get some privilege. And let's think about the techniques that we used, right? Hardware is hard, so let's try and make it easier, right? So let's come up with a sequence. We use physical access to do a hardware attack, okay? If we didn't need to do that, why would we be even talking about hardware? Step 2, we use that hardware to escalate software privilege, right? Okay, now we're done. Like, we use software privilege to do all the dirty work. The joke I say over and over again, and I probably should stop saying because it's a little overused, I'm a hardware person, right? I deal with hardware problems. As soon as I make it a software problem, it's someone else's problem, right? And there's lots of people who are really good at software stuff, and I'm not. So that's the opportunity to give that work to someone else, to turn the hardware issue into a software issue. So don't assume it's too hard, right? Look for the shortcuts. Is there an existing tool that will let you do what you want to do, right? You want to attack via USB, you don't have to build it from scratch. It's useful to, but you don't have to be the one to build it from scratch. Use a tool that already exists. Is there a dev board that I can work off of, right? Even if there's not a tool that already exists, you don't have to go and spin a PCB and solder parts onto a board. There are 1,000,001 development boards for every single chip under the sun that let you go and test all these features out, all this functionality out, without actually having to build any hardware yourself. Can observing the hardware tell me more about the software, right? We talked about the flashing lights. We talked about network and data access, right? When you just sit there and look at a system, you learn so much about what it's doing, why it's doing it, and when it does it, right? When you can characterize a system in steady state, you can go and start poking at it, punching it, turning switches on and off, shorting wires out, and you'll actually see what's different when you do those things. Physical access is great because we take a scenario that would be a black box scenario and turn it into a white box scenario, right? If you're contracted to do a pen test on an IoT device and they say, oh, we only want to do a software pen test, we only want to do a network pen test, we don't want to do hardware stuff, we're not worried about that. Well, do you really believe them when they say that? Because if you take 5 minutes of physical access and you get root shells on it, you know a lot more about the system. If you take 5 minutes of access and get passwords off of it, you know a lot more about it. If you can take 5 minutes of physical access and get binaries off that you can reverse engineer, you know a whole lot more about that, right? If they want a software attack, using the hardware might be the easiest way to get the information you need to deliver that software attack. And perhaps you can point out to them that, yes, we could do this the black box approach, or we could do it in half the time or a quarter of the time and, you know, just look at the system. So with all these things, it's really useful to get help. You've seen in the background lots of little videos of little soldering things going on. I'm OK at soldering. I can get the solder to stick and not look too disgusting. But there's a lot of times when I really just want to make sure something works reliably. And if I'm soldering more than 2 or 3 wires, like when I decide to hook up 16 wires in parallel, I pretty frequently get someone else to do that soldering for me, because I know a lot of people who are excellent at soldering and reliable and know and have all the tools, right? So is there someone who can help you with the hardware components that you're not familiar with? It's really useful. On the other hand, if your skill is software stuff, is there someone that you can help with software with, right? I'm always coming up with these hardware things, and I get so far, and then it comes to the software spot, and I usually just drop them. So if you've got the software skill, that's actually a really valuable skill set to someone who has the hardware skills but doesn't know where to go once they've got the firmware off, once they've got the passwords out. You don't really need to do it all. And there is another fable. I couldn't find an accurate picture, the duck and the serpent, right? And the story of the duck and the serpent is that the duck is bragging. He's saying, oh, I can swim, I can fly, I can waddle around on the ground. And the serpent just kind of slithers around and says, yeah, but can you swim as good as a fish? Can you soar like an eagle? Can you run like a cheetah? You know, the point of the moral of the story is you can't do it all. Don't try to do it all. But there is great benefit in having the precise skills. There is great benefit in having a little bit of the other skills just to give you the information you need to know about what's going on. So how can we apply this if, let's say, we have a hardware product? You can harden your hardware, right? Whether you like it or not, the software you have runs on hardware. If you're an app developer, your software runs on hardware. If you're a web developer, your software runs on hardware. If you're anybody else, yeah, your software runs on hardware. Even if it runs on virtualization, the virtualization runs on hardware. If you've got a hardware product, how much would someone spend to attack it, right? If you're worried about someone spending, $10,000 on, CPU time to crack some hashes, right? Maybe you should be worried about someone spending $100 on hardware to break your hardware. And then if you are down to the level of dealing with some hardware, don't mark your test points, right? Disable your debug output. I'm going to rattle through very quickly these couple things. And assume your firmware is dumped. All of these are about expectations, right? Don't expect that no one's going to poke at this stuff. Don't expect that it's too expensive for someone to put effort into poking at these things. Just assume that someone's going to look at these things. Also, a lot of people talk about like exotic hardware defenses. Like, we're going to make chips that have meshes on top that make it obvious if someone tries to tamper with our chips. And that's really great. That sounds awesome. But when you get down to it, you'll have these chips in systems that have active mesh protection. Active mesh, basically a layer of metal on top of the chip that prevents you from, that lets the chip know when it's been tampered with and can kill stuff, wipe firmware, stuff like that. And they'll go and they'll leave open debug headers, right? And they'll go and they'll have firmware unsecured on a flash chip that's easily accessible. So it's the moral of the story of the ducks and the tortoise, right? Tortoises have shells, right? Shells are cool. We all like shells. But the tortoise was kind of sad because he only gets to walk around very slowly on the ground. So he says to the ducks, hey, would you take me up in the air one time? I think it'd be really cool. And so the ducks are like, yeah, sure, we could do that. Like, we'll hold on to this stick. You just hold on in the middle with your mouth, and we'll fly up in the air. Just don't say anything. So, of course, they start flapping their wings. They get up in the air, and the turtle is very excited to see everything he can see. And a crow flies by and says, whoa, you must be the greatest turtle in the world. You're up here flying. And, of course, the turtle is excited. Says, oh, of course I am. And, of course, he opens his mouth, and he falls, and his shell cracks, and he dies. Lots of death in these stories. I didn't recall this when I was a kid, but apparently it stuck with me. The point is, like, you know, how am I relating this? Don't be too cocky about the things that you get done, right? Don't think, oh yeah, I just dumped that firmware, I'm awesome, I can do anything. You'll realize that when you get too bold, you're going to start frying more hardware. When you get too bold, you're going to start bricking more stuff. You're going to start missing all the little things that you should be paying attention to. So that's sort of that one. I kind of missed it. So hardware isn't as hard as it seems, right? A little bit goes a long way for now. That may change as time progresses. And keep your expectations realistic, right? Don't expect to open up hardware and have it all make sense the first time you look at a circuit board, right? Don't expect to grab firmware off a device and have it work perfectly the first time, right? If you come in with these expectations, then you know, you're really just setting yourself up for a failure. Most importantly, get help and share what you find, right? There are people with skills that you don't have. There are people without the skills that you have. So if you can put those connections together, you'll actually have a lot more luck making progress on hacking around with all sorts of different things, whether or not it's just hardware. So to close, I'm going to just revisit this Jemima puddle duck. And there's actually another Beatrix Potter story that features the puddle ducks. And it's the story of Tom Kitten. And Tom Kitten is kind of this Tom Sawyer-y character that goes off and has adventures. And at some point in time, he like goes swimming and leaves all his clothes on the side of the shore and like comes home and has lost his clothes and gets in trouble. But the puddle ducks come up and they see these clothes and they try on these clothes. And are like, oh, this is pretty cool. And they walk around in Kitten's clothes for a little while. I don't know what Kitten's clothes look like, but then in the end, they just get tired, so they go back to swimming in the pool, and they lose the clothes, and they sink to the bottom, and Tom Kitten never gets his clothes back. The point is, I have a point for this one, try things out, right? Try on someone else's clothes, not literally. I mean, like, try the hardware role, try the software role, try the web app stuff. Having an understanding of what's possible in all of the aspects of information security is really beneficial to actually understanding how you can use your expertise in the best possible way. And with that, that is how I think you can make the most of your hard work.